Now we're going to begin Chapter 8. We'll explore GDP, or measuring the total production and income in an economy. Going forward through the rest of this class, we'll be looking at more macroeconomic topics instead of just the general introductory economic topics, so we'll really get into the meat of this course. In this chapter, first we're going to look at gross domestic product and see how it measures total production, and break down total production, see exactly what components go into estimating the GDP. Next section, we'll explore whether GDP measures what we really want it to measure. Obviously it measures total production, but how valuable is actually knowing what total production is, and what can it actually tell us about an economy? The next section will compare real GDP versus nominal GDP, so we'll see the effect of price changes on what a measure of GDP is. In the last section, we'll briefly touch on other measures of total production and total income, see what other alternatives are out there. Microeconomics is a study of how households and firms make choices, how they interact in markets, and how the government attempts to influence their choices. It's very focused in on this individual level decision making. On the other hand, macroeconomics is a study of the economy as a whole. So this includes topics like inflation, unemployment, economic growth, international trade between countries. Things focusing on larger the total economy instead of on the individuals making the decisions within the economy. So when we want to study the overall economy level actions of people and governments, these models and tools of macroeconomics become very useful, whereas they're less useful when we're looking at different microeconomic topics. Now, what are some places that you'll want to know macroeconomics or understand macroeconomics models? Well, if you're a firm trying to decide whether you want to invest in a new factory to increase production, you might want to know what's going on in the overall economy. You may want to see if GDP is increasing or decreasing, if unemployment is rising or falling, because these will have impacts for how many consumers are going to want to buy your goods. Likewise, if you're an individual trying to make a big purchase, so say a new car or a house, you may want to know what's going on, again, with GDP and the unemployment rate. If a lot of people are beginning to lose their jobs or companies are failing, you may want to hold off on making those purchases, at least in the short run, so you know your job's safe and you're going to have the income to pay for those over time. Before we get started diving into macroeconomic models, there's some important terms I want to cover that we'll be using throughout the next several chapters. The first is the business cycle. So these are alternating periods of economic expansion and economic recession. The business cycle represents how an economy is doing over time. So there's going to be a growth period where the economy starts doing well. There's going to be a peak where we reach the best we're doing, at least in the short run. And then there's going to be a downward slide where the economy is doing worse. And this is going to continue up and down over time. So the expansion is a period of a business cycle during which the total production and total employment are increasing. These are the good times that we all enjoy. Then the recession is a period of a business cycle during which the total production and the total employment are decreasing. Economic growth is the ability of an economy to produce increasing quantities of goods and services. Over time, economies tend to grow. We don't see recessions that last very long. So much of the business cycle is the expansion period or the economic growth period. Inflation rate is the last term before we get started. The inflation rate is the percentage increase in the price level from one year to the next. So that's how difficult it is to buy goods or services. Obviously, many of us, when we're going to the grocery store, we're trying to buy things that we need, that we tend to purchase repeatedly over time. We notice as the prices go up over time. These make it more difficult for consumers to keep purchasing the same amount of goods, have the same standard of living, when the costs are increasing over time. So it's important to know what the inflation rate is. Over the next chapters, we're going to explore the many aspects of the economy. So this will include how all the elements in the previous slide relate to one another. Now for this chapter, we have a much less lofty goal. We're focusing on just one specific area. We're going to look at how to measure the total output in an economy. Being able to measure the total output is incredibly important because much of macroeconomics depends on our ability to measure and predict aggregate economic activity. This is the main measure that most people look at when they're trying to decide the health of an economy. In the press, especially the financial press, like the Wall Street Journal, you'll typically see headlines about GDP. So second quarter GDP rose 3.1%. GDP stalls this month. Things like that. So let's look at what GDP measures and how it measures total production. So the most common measure used by economists of the overall economic activity is gross domestic product. So that's why we're starting with it. So definition of gross domestic product is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country during a period of time. Now, the typical time period we look at is 1 year, but we'll also look at changes each quarter, so each 3 months of the year. Now, we'll explore each part of this definition in turn because it's very important to understand what exactly goes into GDP. In the United States, the GDP is calculated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, where actually one of my former coworkers used to work helping compile GDP. And they issue reports on GDP every 3 months. So the first component of the definition of GDP that I want to break down further is market values. So we say the market value of all final goods and services. Well, we can't add together the number of cars, melons, haircuts, all these different products that are being produced without agreeing on some common way to measure them. There's no way to compare 6 cars to a certain number of melons. That doesn't make any sense. So instead of looking at just the quantity, what we end up doing is adding up the market value. So how much they sell for, what the price they're selling for is. This is the easiest and the most practical way to be able to do this. And because everything, all the goods and services in an economy are placed in dollar terms to be bought and sold, we have this pricing mechanism already being used. So it's the easiest way to add up the value of goods and services, to understand how many we're producing. The next part of the definition of GDP that I want to focus on is final goods and services. The definition of a final good or a service is a good or a service that's purchased by the final user. So that's the person that's actually going to be using the product. These are what's used to calculate GDP, not other purchases of that good or service. So now why do we do this? If we counted intermediate goods and services as well, so the ones that are inputs into another good or service, then we would end up double counting. So for instance, if we counted tires that were being sold to an auto manufacturer to put on their car, we would end up counting a tire twice. First, when it was being sold to the auto manufacturer, and then we would count it when it was being sold to the consumer as part of the car. So because of that, we only count the final goods. And we also only count it when it's being purchased by a consumer from a store for the first time. So if you purchase a DVD and then turn around and resell it later on Amazon or at a yard sale, we don't count that as a part of GDP because it's already been purchased and some of its value has been consumed. So for another example, if we counted the value of ice cream bought by a store and also counted the value of ice cream when it was sold to the consumer, again, we would be double counting the wholesale value of that ice cream. And finally, we look at gross domestic product during a period of time. So if we want to measure the total output in a given year, we measure the goods and services produced and consumed only in that given year. And again, this is done so we prevent this double counting, like on the previous slide. So if you buy a DVD in 2011, and that DVD counts in 2011 GDP. If you resell it in 2012, it's not going to count again in 2012. So the GDP only counts new goods or services. So again, like I mentioned, used items that are previously produced and counted, they don't need to be counted again because we haven't produced anything new. Even though they're still creating value for consumers, they're not actually being produced that year. And that's what we're trying to measure with GDP. So when we think of GDP, we can think of it in 2 ways. We can measure the total production in an economy or the total income in an economy. And when we measure one, we're necessarily measuring the other. By definition, they're going to be equal to each other. Now, why is this? Everything that's produced and sold constitutes income for someone. So we have the choice of measuring the value of products that are produced and sold or the value of incomes because the money that's spent on those goods or services becomes the income for someone else. So they're both valid ways of measuring economic activity. And when we choose which way to measure GDP, we can do it by choosing which one is easier or which one's more accurate. So let's look at why this is the case. So we'll start with a very simple model of the economy, where we just have households and firms. So if we want to measure the overall economic activity, we can measure the amount of money that households spend on goods and services. Or we can measure the income to households. Obviously, this is a very simplistic version of the economy. So let's add in a couple more layers to this. First, we can start with the government. So how does the government affect economic activity? Well, first it takes taxes from households and firms. And it uses those taxes, that money that it takes from firms and from individuals, to buy goods and services and to make transfer payments. Transfer payments are payments to households for which a government does not receive a good or service in return. So these are things like Medicare, Social Security, different welfare programs. Now, not all economic activity just takes place within people and firms in the United States. Some of it takes place between the rest of the world. So households buy goods and services from firms in other countries. These are known as imports. These are goods that are made in other countries and then being brought in and sold in the United States. Firms also sell goods and services to households in other countries. These are known as exports. Finally, there are firms that deal specifically in the flows of money between different parties. These are basically banks in the banking system. So we're going to label these the financial system. So sometimes households don't spend some of their income, and instead they save it in the financial system. They place it in banks, or they'll invest it in different stocks and bonds. So these financial system firms lend money to other firms and to the government. So this money doesn't just stay in the firms, like in their vaults, but actually comes back into the economy, being used by other firms or other entities. Because we have several different players in this model of our macroeconomy, in order to estimate the GDP and to actually measure it, we can break it down into different components for the different players that are taking part in this. So when we measure GDP, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is part of the Department of Commerce, measures 4 major categories of expenditures based on who's involved in spending the money. So the first is personal consumption expenditures, which we label consumption, or represent with the letter C. Then there's gross private domestic investment, which we call investment, or I. There's government consumption and gross investment, or government purchases, which we label G. And there's net exports of goods and services, which we call net exports and label NX. So when we actually add up GDP and attempt to measure GDP, we can express it in the following equation. So Y, which is our representation for GDP, equals C plus I plus G plus NX. So now we're going to look at all these different components of GDP and what goes into them. Now the first component, consumption, is spending by households on goods and services. And this is not including spending on new houses, which we're going to count as investment later on. So in the Bureau of Economic Analysis statistics, consumption is divided into 3 different types of expenditures. The first is expenditures on service. So these are things that people actually provide you, like medical care, education, haircuts, not physical products. The next is non-durable goods. So these are goods that you purchase, and once you purchase them, you use up fairly quickly. So these are things like food and clothing. They're a small portion of your income, and they're you don't typically have to take out loans for them because they're a small portion of your income, and they last much shorter. Finally, there's durable goods. So these are goods like automobiles and furniture. Typically, we have to our consumers tend to borrow for them, and they're more expensive and last a lot longer than non-durable goods. The next portion in GDP we'll look at is gross private domestic investment, or just investment. Investment, in this sense, is a little bit different than how we typically use the word investment. Investment is spending by firms on new factories, office buildings, machinery, plus spending by households on new houses. So it's different than how we use in everyday use. So typically when people say they're investing, they'd say like things like the stock market or rare coins. But typically, as economists, we're looking at purchases of machinery, factories, or houses. Now we can break this down into 3 separate categories again. First is business fixed investments. So these are like new factories, office buildings, machinery, research and development, things that go into actually producing goods and producing goods at a lower cost or producing better goods. Next is residential investment. So these are things like single-family houses or apartments, things that'll, places that people live. And finally, there's changes in business inventories. So these are goods that have been produced but have not yet been sold. Because they've been produced, we still need to count them as part of the GDP, as part of our total production, but because they're not sold, they end up in a different category than in consumer spending. Next, we have government purchases. So government purchases are spending by federal, state, and local government on goods and services. So things like teacher salaries, highways, aircraft carriers for the military. These do not include transfer payments, since those don't result in the immediate production of new goods and services. So we're not counting things like welfare, Social Security, things like that. And finally, the last portion of GDP of this equation is net exports. The net exports are the value of goods, or the value of exports, minus the value of imports. So this difference can either be positive or negative. In recent years, it's been negative in the US because we import more goods than we export. Since we want to count domestic production, so we're talking about production within the United States, we add up the value of all the goods and services sold to foreigners. So these are things that we've produced in the United States and are selling to others, and we subtract the value of goods and services sold to Americans by foreigners, because that doesn't tell us what we've produced in the US. So here we have the components of GDP for the year of 2014. So we can break down how big each area tends to be, or each component of GDP. Consumption tends to be the largest component of GDP by far, at almost 70% of GDP is consumption. And within consumption, services tend to be the largest component. Consumer spending on services ends up being about half of total GDP. And there's been a continuing trend in the United States and other high-income countries, so we're moving away from the production of goods and towards a production of services. Investment makes up about 16% of our GDP, and business fixed investments is the largest component of investments. And we'll explore these and how they fluctuate in later chapters. Government purchases are 18.2% of GDP in 2014, so this represents the second largest component of GDP. And purchases made by the state and local governments are actually greater than purchases made by the federal government. This shouldn't be surprising because a lot of basic government activities, so think of like education and law enforcement, are mostly done at the state and the local level. They're not done at the federal level, despite, federal control setting standards and things like that. And finally, there's net exports. Net exports are negative. They're negative 3.1% in 2014 because we have a small trade deficit. Because the value of goods and services we import are greater than those which we export, net exports end up being negative.